So students, this video is based on first topic of paper 14th, that is Critical Theory 2, and the topic is Hayden White's The Historical Text as Literary Artifact. So as suggested by my dear students, this time I have come with notes in the video. I hope it will help you, as you are going to, as those students who had got their admission in MA English, they are going to appear in offline exams for the first time. I hope it will be helpful for all of you. Your exams are quite near. So the topic is the historical text as a literary artifact. So let me give you a gist of this essay in few lines. Just look at the title of this essay, the historical text, and there is the word as, literary artifact. So it's a kind of comparison between the historical text and the literary artifact. So all of us know that literary artifact means any work of literature which has employed all the artistic tropes of literature in it, and it's a product of pure literary devices, right? अगर इसको हम सिंपल वर्ड्स में बोलें, कोई भी ऐसा वर्क जिसमें हमने लिटरेचर की सभी ट्रोप्स को एम्प्लॉय करके, जैसे हमने वी हैव ट्राई टू शेप सम इवेंट्स इन सम काइंड ऑफ लिटरेरी product, you can say, and historical text is compared with such kind of product. I hope the meaning is clear, because if we talk about historical text, the image in our mind is that of some kind of documentation. What we expect from a historical text? We expect a kind of documentation of past. But Hayden White says that any historical text is like some literary piece. It is not a record of truth only. Okay, so to understand his viewpoint, we must know the influences on Hayden White. So we will begin our essay with Hayden White's introduction, of course, and then we will talk about two major influences on Hayden White. So I am going to read the notes along with, and I will try to explain the main parts of it. Hayden White was an American historian in the tradition of literary criticism. He gained much recognition for his work, Meta History, the Historical Imagination in 19th Century Europe, in 1973. This work came in 1973. Two major figures who taught him how the historian interprets something. The first was William J. Bosanbrook, who taught White as an undergraduate at Wayne State University. Bosanbrook had seen history as fundamentally a story of the conflict between ideas, values and dreams. So this was the main point of Bosanbrook, which had attracted Hayden White, that history is not about conflict between persons or personages. History is a kind of conflict between ideas, dreams and values. Therefore, he regarded history as a mystery to be constantly pondered and studied rather than a puzzle to be solved. In his last book, The Practical Past, 2014, White paid tribute to the significant effect of Bosanbrook. The second was Memnoides, a Jewish philosopher. In his interpretation of the Bible, he said that the goal of the Bible interpretation should be to maximize possible interpretations. His influence helped White focus on a variety of possible interpretations of history. What is the main point in this first para? So in the first para, we come to know about different interpretations of history. Ki whenever we read any historical work, we should not consider it as an ultimate truth. Any historical work is not an ultimate truth. It is a kind of work which is open to various interpretations. Why? Because the history is presented by the historian in a kind of narrative. This is the point. So continuing with this point, in the next para, we will talk about making of historical narratives, how the historical narratives are made. In the historical text as literary artifact, Hayden White clearly articulates the role of history in knowledge making. He argues historical narratives are more closely linked with literature than the sciences. Understand this point, that historical narratives are more closely linked with literature than with sciences. If we are talking about science, we are looking for logics, right? But if we say the work is more related with literature, then we are looking for the role of imagination. The reason is because historical narratives employ tropes. And what are tropes? Metaphor, metonymy, synodosh and irony. I hope all of you know these devices. To configure historical events in ways that the audience can relate to. And the next definition from White is really important. He says historians re-implot, re-describe or recode past events so contemporary cultures can make sense of their past. Please try to understand this definition. When a historian is recording something from the past, that event has already taken place, right? And now he is trying to code that event in his language for the future generation to understand the past. So what will the historian do? First, he will re-implot. Look at this word, re-implot. The root of this word is plot, right? Plot is a sequence of incidents or events. Implot is a verb which means to make plotting something. Implot is verb of plot. Then re-implot is reworking on the plot. Second word is redescribing or recoding. So the historian is a kind of imaginative work. When the things have already taken place, he is trying to recode those things in his own way so that the coming generation can make a sense of their past. Histories are similar to fiction because figurative language is used in both genres to help us come to know the actual by contrasting it or liking it to the imaginable. So I hope you understand, when you pick up a historical book to read, the things which are mentioned there have already taken place. Okay, so the reader is trying to imagine the things which has already happened. So history becomes similar to fiction because the language which is used in historical books, they help us to know about the actual. But how the reader is understanding that actual? By way of imagining the past. So both historical narratives and fiction employ similar strategies in making sense of past. So this word is very close to meta history. I hope you have heard about the definition of meta history. I'm trying to give you an idea. You can write it down. So meta history is the attempt to get behind or beneath the presuppositions which sustain a given type of inquiry. In any historical inquiry, there is a truth behind the things, and when we try to reach at that truth behind the events, we call it meta history. I hope this point is clear. So in first para we were talking about introduction of Hayden White and the influences on him. In second we talk about making of historical narratives and how the historical narratives are made. Historical narratives are made with the help of literary devices, right? So whether the events are real or imagined, the critic tries to work on it. So these two paras talk about how a historical narrative is made. Next we will talk about the role of rhetoric. Now just if you want to understand this essay fully, you just imagine a historian. In your minds, you imagine a historian who is going to write a historical text. Okay, what the writer will do? First, he will choose a time period on which he will write. Then he will make a sequence of the events about which he is going to write. Then he will adjust those incidents into a plot, right? So in all this setting, there is a role of rhetoric as well. So White's arguments, in the third para we will be talking about role of rhetoric. White's arguments make an important contribution to historiography. His argument provides historians with a means to develop a historical consciousness by helping them recognize the fictive elements in their historical events. Now how Hayden White has helped? That now we could recognize what are the imaginative elements in the historical events. We should not accept historical events as the mirror truth only. They also talk about imaginative things. It would help them to realize the correct perception of the way things really are. The historian will no longer be captive of ideological preconceptions. Although White doesn't mention rhetoric, yet the connection of history with rhetoric cannot be ignored. The canon of rhetoric keeps expanding with time. So, if you want to have a more clear knowledge of it, you must read about the canon of rhetoric. I will give you a hint of canon of rhetoric, that rhetoric is an art of speaking, rhetoric is the art of lecturing. So, it keeps expanding with time because the person who is delivering a lecture, his or her knowledge keeps on adding, and this canon of rhetoric is ever expanding. The ancient rhetorical canon is strong and narrow. It is slowly being expanded, but we know the history of our field through canonical text, right? So, whatever we are reading today, those things have been recorded in some text, and those are called canonical text. So, canonical texts are talking about rules. So, in next para we will talk about canon. Canon is considered as a grand narrative of the history of rhetoric. We need notice tropes employed, mythos, imaginary, real ideologies used in reproduction of these canonical texts. Without noticing these elements, we cannot have full information. As Kellner tells, we cannot have reality, but we can claim it, and we do claim it with rhetoric. So, it is very important to develop a historical consciousness of our own field. According to White, we must develop a meta-history of rhetoric. It will help us to acknowledge, recognize, and understand how and why our discipline's history has been created the way it has. Who is benefited by this historical narrative and who is not. So, all of this information will come to us only through the reading of canonical text. The rules which are regarding the text which are regarding the rules. Developing a meta history of our field is also important because we need to be aware of the fact that rewriting history means rewriting the present. Canons, theories, and methodologies incorporate the values of a disciplinary community. So, rewriting history incorporates contemporary values, leading to ask new questions and develop new insights. All this leads to creation of a new history and ultimately to a new understanding of the present. As Berlin reminds us, when we write history, we also create our hopes and visions for the future. Therefore, by rewriting history, we also write our future. So, this para is about element of present time in writing history. See, when the writer starts writing about history, now understand the time sequence. The writer who is going to record historical events is writing about the things which had already taken place in the past, but he is recording the events in the present time, and that present time will ultimately have an effect in writing history, because that time is providing consciousness to the writer. So it will play its role in writing history, because the historical writer is trying to create his hope and visions for the future. The historian is writing about past, but he writing in the present, and the readers belong to future. So understand this sequence of time in writing history. You understand, historian is writing about the past, he is writing in the present, and the readers who are going to read that work, they belong to future. So this is how all the time sequences are mingled. So in this scenario, what is the importance of historical consciousness? Seen in this light, we must develop focus on the kind of present and future we want to create for the discipline. We must imagine how our discipline will change as we begin to add alternative histories to the canon. The possible changes and the changes we want to introduce all are important. The ideologies which work to introduce alternative histories to the already established canon need be studied. White's argument is important to rhetorical studies because it inspires us to ask such important questions. It helps us to develop our own historical consciousness as a discipline and individual scholars. right? So why historical consciousness or awareness to the history is important, that we should not depend on one kind of books only. We should be reading all the books related with that discipline, whether they are written in favor of it or against it, right? So now up to this point we were talking about historical consciousness. In the next para we will discuss how myth mingles with historical consciousness. Historians must rely on historical imagination such as filling in the blanks or making assumptions about events. History is a constructive enterprise and historians are trained to perceive patterns that may or may not have existed. If historians rely on the historical imagination, then historiography and historical literature are qualitatively similar. White admits that conflation of mythic and historical consciousness will offend some historians and disturb literary theorists, because theorists are looking for logical reasoning, and in history we are mixing, the historians are mixing myths with historical consciousness. Thus White explores the inherent problem of objectivity in historical accounts. So now he comes to the conclusion that any historical account cannot be called objective. It is kind of mixture of imagination with fact. Fiction and history have been treated as distinct genres. Historical accounts are essentially stories pieced together from facts and chronologies, and some are highlighted as more important than others. They are emotionally colored by the preferences and culture of the historian. For example, a historical situation is not inherently tragic or comic. Its painting as such may be necessary for a culture. Historical accounts are the writing down of events which the historian did not experience firsthand. It necessarily evoked inference. The historian also incorporates theme and literary devices such as causality between events. If we look at historical accounts as subjective, then paradoxically the more accounts we have of an event, the harder it is to figure out the truth. This para is really very important and it will change your idea about how we can equate history with fiction. Now, historian was writing about the past, he was writing in the present, and he was writing for the readers who are going to read his book in the future, right? So he was developing his historical consciousness, but he was presenting the events by mingling it with myth. Now, what effect does this mingling have on historical text? The effect is the work becomes more akin to, it's more likely to become a work of fiction than a work of documentation. Why? Because the historian is after all a human being. He belongs to certain social class. So his preference, his culture, his background will ultimately color the events of the past. You understand? He will color some pictures in his emotions. Here the White says that no historical event is inherently tragic or comic, but the association of the historian with that event makes it tragic or comic. I hope you understand that point, because the historian is, after all, he is a human being. He is presenting the ideas with inference from his own self. So that makes historical events more close to fictional events. So science is not, like history is not like science. Science is constantly questioned, whereas history is not. Much like literary classics are not, it makes history more like literature in that sense. Whatever we read, we believe it. But in science, we have to, prove everything. It makes history more like literature in that sense. White has made a distinction between two elements of historical accounts. First, the pure chronicle, containing information on time and place, and second, the sentimental significance of the chronology. Sometimes the writers of history have motives like instruction or satire. Again, we are talking about the person who is writing, who is recording history. What is his motive? What does he want to say? Whether he is in a mood of instruction or whether he wants to make a satire on certain historical principles, or he is trying to teach you some lesson by narrating some historical events. So that motive of historian will automatically color the events. It has all the characteristics of a story and we must sift through it to pick out the truth. White's skillful dismantling of the opposition between history and literature has paved the way for many productive studies in both fields. So, sum up, we can say some historians have objected to his narrowing of history to language. More post-structuralist minded literary critics have taken issue with his structuralist reductionism. Now, what is structuralist reductionism? That White has discussed historical text on the levels of structure only, right? But some post-structuralists, they are more interested in analyzing the idea behind the structure. According to Levi-Strauss, our explanation of historical processes are determined more by what we leave out than what we put in. What we put in is the structure and what we leave out is the post-structuralism. So, White's theories about the literary nature of historical discourse challenged historians to reconsider the relationship between history and fiction. His work has principally been debated in historical theory circles. His final work suggests practical possibilities for public history. So, these are the main points in this essay. I hope this video will be helpful for you, and do let me know about your reviews in the comment section below. Thank you very much.